Take a look at this statue. Maybe you think it looks aesthetically pleasing. Maybe you think it looks boring. How did you decide that? And is it possible to disagree? My name is Ethan, and I'll be presenting on the book The Cycladic Spirit for my project. This book was written by Colin Renfrew and works through the material culture of the prehistoric Cycladic people. While he discusses many different archaeological finds, including pottery and stone creations, for the sake of my presentation, I will be focusing on the Cycladic figure because of its unique features and development. While this book is partly an objective approach to understanding the Cycladic culture, its main goal is to address a larger and more important question: why we admire so much today these works that a century ago were considered barbaric. In other words, does art have an inherent and objective aesthetic value, or is its beauty solely in the eye of the beholder? Similarly, this book explores the value of abstract art, specifically in terms of depicting the human form. The Cyclades are islands in the Aegean Sea, as you can see marked on this map, right off the mainland Greece. The reason they are called the Cyclades is because they believe that Apollo placed them in a circle around the island of Delos, where the Delphic Oral lived. This book describes how there are records of people visiting these islands as far back as 8000 BC, but the first real inhabitants settled around 3500 BC. The figures that we will be exploring were created over 4,000 years ago during the Cycladic Bronze Age. As this time is prehistoric, we have no written records of their civilization, and everything we know about them comes from archaeological interpretation. The author divides this period that we will be covering into two. Early Cycladic 1 covers 3300 BC to 2700 BC and includes the first settlers in the Cyclades in the early Bronze Age. Early Cycladic 2 includes 2700 BC to 2300 BC, and it is during this period that there is a larger population, more advancements in tools, and the creation of the canonical figure. The Cyclades have rich sources of marble and consequently use this marble to make bowls, grave cysts, figures, beads, and more. A great deal of the material culture that remains today has been discovered in graves protected from degradation by the elements. While other materials may have corroded, marble's sturdiness allowed many things to stand the test of time. From these finds, archaeologists have concluded that the early Cycladic civilization was made up of spread out settlements on various islands with only a few families present at each. Next, the author categorizes the Cycladic figures into different groups, and I will walk you through the different types to give you an idea of a Cycladic style as well as their progression over time. During early Cycladic 1, there were marble figures that were created, but they are not considered canonical for reasons that we will discuss later. However, as precursors, they provide insight into how the canonical figure came to be. Some of the oldest figures are those of the Pelos group, also known as the fiddle figurines because of their shape. These figures are clear abstractions of the human body. Being half an inch thick with no real distinction of a head, these are sometimes found in large quantities in graves. While they may not appear very impressive, they set the tone for the figures that will come in the future. Later in early Cycladic 1, the Plastira group figures arise, and here's an example. As you can see, the figures are much more realistic, standing with crossed arms over the torso and prominent noses. It has many features that we will see in the canonical figures. However, what excludes them is actually that they are too realistic. Facial features like eyes and fairly realistic and round modeling of the body parts will disappear in early Cycladic 2. These figures may lack some elegance and simplicity, but they are key for informing us that the abstract forms we will come to see were not chosen out of limitation of skill or tools, but intentional choice instead. The final category in early Cycladic 1 is the Loros group, considered a transitional group between the two time periods. These figures begin to demonstrate some of the simplicity and reduction of form we will come to see, such as the oddly shaped and flat head. With no nose or real arms, these are really unique abstractions of the human body. Next, we will explore the canonical figures of early Cycladic 2. These are figures that received the most attention and stand out in art history for several reasons, the first being their unity. These folded arm figures hold closely to a strict set of design principles. All but one of these figures are female, and in almost all of the figures, the right arm is crossed above the left. The figures have wide and flat heads with noticeable noses as the only facial feature, long cylindrical necks, flat legs that are flexed at the knee, and pointed toes. However, within this set of boundaries, there is a great deal of creativity and uniqueness in the canonical figures. Most shockingly, the figures have an enormous range in size, with the smallest being around 4 inches and the largest being fully life-sized. Additionally, incisions can be used to indicate fingers, toes, and the pubic area, as there is variation in the body shape of the figures. The author groups the canonical figures into 5 categories. While these are not strictly chronological or always limited geographically, they can give helpful understanding of the range within these figures. The author believes that the Capsala variety shown here may be the first of the canonical figures to be created. The reason they believe these may be the oldest is because of their proximity to the Plastira group figures that we saw earlier. Although the figure has gotten much flatter, it still retains some of the round modeling as seen in the breast. These figures get their name from a cemetery that was discovered on the island of Amorgos. As you can see, Capsala figures lack descriptive incisions. These are smaller figures, usually less than 10 inches, and their feet are curved significantly. Next, we have the Dacthysmata variety, also named after a cemetery on Amorgos. I find these fascinating because they really embrace the abstraction, being exceedingly thin and exaggeratedly sharp. The round modeling we have seen previously is absent, and the head moves towards more of a triangular shape, and the shoulders become more broad. The neck is extra long and thin, and incisions are used to detail the toes and pubic area of the figure. The Shalandriani variety are very visually interesting as well. A key feature of these is the square shape created by the shoulders, elbows, and arms. The head is tilted farther back than the other varieties, giving an even more dramatic version of the figure. The necks are thicker and cylindrical, and the noses are often less sharp. These figures lack waists, with the legs beginning immediately below the folded arms. Additionally, these are the only figures that sometimes have the left arm above the right. These figures are described as less graceful and more unrefined in the book, but I think their abstract nature makes them exceptionally interesting. The Kumasa variety are actually only found in Crete, demonstrating how the style of Cycladic art may have had influence beyond the islands. These figures are some of the smallest, being 2 to 8 inches tall. As you can see, they have broad shoulders and no visible knees. While they might not be able to be considered Cycladic art strictly, they certainly illuminate how the Cycladic figure affected life in other geographic locations. And finally, there is the Spado variety. These are believed to have developed from the Capsal variety, and similarly, it has slightly rounded modeled features, and they have thicker bodies than most canonical figures. The author describes this category as a sort of catch-all, including a large variety of shapes and sizes. The head normally have lyre shapes, and there are not usually very many incisions in the marble. One of the most unique aspects of Cycladic figures is that there are a few that are life-size. At this point in history, before 2500 BC, only Egypt, Malta, and Mesopotamia have been shown to have life-size statues. This feat is all the more impressive because the Cyclades were believed to be significantly less densely populated than these other areas. This reality demonstrates how large of an impact seeing these statues may have had on the ancient viewers. While contemporary art includes countless life-size statues, this was exceedingly unique and creative for its time. This picture is of the second tallest figure, standing 4.5 feet high. Fascinatingly, it still appears to be comparable to the other figures that are only a few inches tall, once again demonstrating their adherence to canon. Not only do these set of rules work artistically on a small scale, but clearly on a large one as well, and this figure has a simultaneously dominating and balanced presence. And last but certainly not least, we have the non-canonical figures, or those that do not fit in specific rules that we have laid out. From the presence of eyes and ears to repositioned arms and heads, while these are less common, they are able to express action and mobility in new ways. The author believes that the tranquil folded arm position of the canonical figures may have indicated divinity. However, some non-canonical works, as seen here, demonstrate how the abstract description of human form can work successfully in other contexts. The most notable of these figures are those shown below, holding a cup, playing the harp, and playing the flute. There are also double figures standing on top of each other that appear to be doing acrobatics, and these statues give us more context for what their uses may have been. While it is possible that these figures were made solely to put in graves, as this is usually where they are found, the author believes they must have had other uses in everyday life, as other common objects are also discovered in the graves. Additionally, many seem broken and repaired, implying that their use was somehow involved in breaking them, and also many are too big to fit in a grave. What exactly they represented is up for debate. Ancestors, guides to the underworld, divinities, or even toys, because of their prehistoric nature, we cannot be sure. The author also points out that their similarity in appearance cannot definitively imply the same identity, especially since we know mainland Greece and other surrounding cultures to have pantheons with many different gods. Their pointed toes mean that they were possibly propped up against a wall and used as a household deity. Maybe they were used symbolically in cult rituals or something like that. Only one out of every 10 burials from the early Cycladic II period were discovered with a figure inside, and only the most wealthy could probably afford burial, meaning while these figures may appear proliferous to us, they were probably less common than we think. Whatever their use is, we will now explore their artistic value and return to our main question. Is the aesthetic value of this art timeless or subjective? One of the first people to discover these Cycladic figures was Paul Wolters in 1891. He describes the head that he found as repulsively ugly, and his contemporaries were in fairly united agreement. Although many of these types of papers were written in German or French, I discovered my counterblast to this book in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Bulletin Volume 30. It is titled A Cycladic Statuette and was written by Christine Alexander in 1935. Similar to Renfrew, she objectively describes the features of the statue. However, she concludes that the canonical figures are, for the most part, crude images, but with an occasional example of sculptural significance. Additionally, she disagrees with Renfrew, claiming that because the figures had only been discovered in graves, that they are not cult images, but servants of the dead. She describes the figures as simple and primitive, but admits they may have appeal to the modernists, specifically in relation to Cubism. In the early 1900s, these figures were seen as plain, barbaric, and unartistic. Holding on to the Renaissance value of describing the human form accurately, they were unable to see much value in these figures other than their archaeological significance. Today, however, these figures are exceedingly valuable and are prized not solely for their age, but for how they play with form, abstraction, line, and harmony. It took less than 100 years for the general artistic community to completely oscillate in its opinion. This begs the question, is there anything objectively artistically valuable about these figures? Are these sleek, monochromatic, and simplified statues beautiful regardless of the generally accepted view? Were the ancient Cycladic people privy to some genius form of artistic truth that the discoverers were unable to appreciate? Renfrew will actually say no, and for a few reasons. First, while contemporary artists value these figures so much for their simplicity, it has been discovered that most of them were actually originally painted. Eyes, hair, and other details were painted on and have since been lost. Additionally, the idea of art as a subject is relatively recent. To assume these ancient people created these figures with an aesthetic purpose over a practical purpose is to impose our own understanding on them. It is likely that we appreciate these figures in a way very different than was originally intended. About the value of the figures, Renfrew writes, "They are in no sense inherent in the work. It is we who find them there. Meaning is constructed in the mind, for it is by his or her deliberate contemplation that the object becomes a work of art. Today we appreciate the unique simplifying of the human form, taking away extraneous detail and leaving the bare minimum. These figures may lead us to abstract contemplation, thinking about what it means to be embodied and what it means to be ordinary yet beautiful." While Renfrew disagrees with Alexander's take on the statue, he does not invalidate it. While I was very hesitant at first to accept the author's conclusions, I have begun to see their validity. Because I believe in the universal truth of beauty and value in God and the Bible, it can make me uncomfortable to think of something as subjective in worth. However, I found his claims very compelling and believe that this book will allow me to approach beautiful art in new ways. While the author claims that there is no universal aesthetic, he simultaneously praises these figures for their unique beauty. While I maintain an objective beauty and truth in God, this line of thinking may apply well to art, specifically these figures. Just because their artistic value may be coming from the viewer, that does not have to mean that their beauty is not valid. Although I may find something aesthetically pleasing in 2020 that was considered barbaric in 1981 and simply practical in 2700 BC, I do not need to worry about the inherent value of the piece because the way it affects my mind in this moment is sufficiently valuable to me. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to all of your questions and comments.